Thank you very much. It's a great honor, privilege, and pleasure to be able to help you celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Institute for Global Economics. Congratulations to IGE for its many accomplishments over 3 decades. The entire world knows of Korea's success. Integrating into the world was and is an important part of Korea's transformation from a very poor developing country to advanced country status. IGE's role and contributions have been extremely important in that success and are well known internationally, of course, as well as in Korea. Since the end of the Dark Ages, it's been clear to almost everybody that human progress depends heavily on learning from evidence and experience. IGE has been important in enabling Koreans to learn from their own experience and also from that of other countries, and at the same time, it has contributed greatly to the rest of the world's understanding and learning about development from what happened in Korea and the lessons for other countries. That has helped many in the rest of the world as they seek to enhance their own economies. IGE has provided a forum not only to learn and evaluate, but also to share knowledge of Korea's economic policy and performance with the rest of the world. My congratulations. The hallmarks of Korea's success are everywhere and are well known. I've been privileged to be a witness to many of them. I first visited Korea in 1974, and at that time, you could still see traces of the poverty and disarray that had characterized the years after 1953, when the Korean War had ended. It was remarkable to revisit many times after 1974 and to see how much had changed in very short periods of time. In fact, coming 6 months apart on occasion, there were places where I did not recognize where I was. I'm sometimes afraid that Koreans themselves do not realize how remarkable their story is. I am not sure they are aware of the role that open trading policies has contributed to their success. In 1960, Korea's exports were only 3% of GDP. By the mid-1980s, they were over 35%, and as Fred Bergsten said, there was even a current account surplus at that time. Real wages doubled in each decade from 1960 to 1990, and in the 1990s, economists thought, until the 1960s, economists thought that no country could grow at a sustained rate of more than 6 or 7% annually. The South Korean economy exceeded 10% growth for more than a decade after the policy reforms of the early 1960s, and was among the most rapidly growing countries in the world for several decades thereafter, and the myth about 6% was entirely forgotten. South Korean exports of goods and services make the country one of the top 10 leading trading nations in the world, as was also mentioned earlier. Exports have played an important role in Korea's success, as they have for most poor countries that chose to open their economies. Exports provide competition for domestic manufacturers. They enable new entrepreneurs and growing businesses to learn much from the rest of the world. And they enable access to knowledge much more cheaply than if people have to learn everything independently of others' experiences. Exporting lets efficient firms expand and use their competitive advantage more, and far beyond that they could use if they were confined to selling in the domestic market. The benefits of international trade and other linkages between countries and regions have been demonstrated repeatedly. After the Second World War, trade liberalization and falling transport and communications costs led to increased integration of the entire international economy and accelerated growth. Growth in world exports is estimated to have been almost double the rate of growth of world GDP in the ensuing half-century. Trade was surely an engine of growth during that time and will continue to be. That growth took place in the context of an international trading order under the auspices of the GATT and then the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. It's the organization whose members agreed to the rules of the game for international trade and agreed on a rules-based trading system. Those rules included that nations would not discriminate among their trading partners unless they went whole hog and had either a free trade agreement or a customs union. The second rule was that traders would receive national treatment in the courts of the countries in which they were trading. The third was that economies would be open and tariffs would be the only trade barriers, with a very few exceptions for developing countries. National security was the second exception. The final rule I want to make is countries would make their trade policies transparent. All of this was to take place under the rule of law and not under the power of the biggest countries or the biggest bullies in the system. The WTO articles, which are a treaty signed by all members and thus constitute its constitution, also provided for a dispute settlement mechanism so that if a country violated its obligations, the offended country could bring them to a panel for dispute settlement. It was hoped and intended that trade wars of the type that had happened in the earlier years and certainly during the 1930s would be resolved by the WTO. The dispute settlement mechanism was a very important part of the WTO system and participated or enabled the settlement of many things that might otherwise have become serious disputes. But the WTO and the GATT before it did much more. The most important one I should point out is that it was the Secretariat for successive rounds of reciprocal tariff reductions. Countries met and bargained with each other, exchanging tariff reductions, which applied to all importing trading partners because of this non-discrimination clause. Through successive rounds of trade negotiations by the year 2000, most advanced countries had very low tariffs on most imported goods. The EU and the US each had an average tariff rates under 5% on those commodities on which there were tariffs. The world economy grew at a never-before-experienced rate of growth after the end of the Second World War, although most analysts expected to learn much from the rest of the world. Growth rates of trade and world GDP would taper off afterward, they thought. The immediate post-war period went, but the growth rate did not taper off, and the world as a whole experienced the highest rate of growth of any quarter century in history, other than a few years every now and then rebounding from plague or famine, and probably any half century. After a pause with the oil price increase in the 1970s, global growth resumed at a rapid pace, with developing countries' rates of growth accelerating as they abandoned, or at least mitigated and moderated, their protectionist policies, and as the examples of South Korea and the other Asian tigers showed what could be achieved by integrating with the world economy. Even the global recession late in the first decade of this century did not stop the momentum, although it did slow it down. But the pessimist fears that countries would adopt protectionist measures, as had happened during the Great Depression, did not materialize. Instead, the growth of trade and real GDP resumed, albeit at a slower pace, after 2009. Now, the reason I go through all this is because the next point is to notice that the United States was a very strong supporter of open trade and was indeed a leader in the negotiations for the GATT and then the WTO in the immediate post-war years. It continued supporting open trade in the two organizations and in its own policies, and had one of the most open economies in the world. The U.S. also took the initiative in successive rounds of trade negotiations for reciprocal tariff reductions. The policies were hugely successful for the countries opening up their own economies, and even those that failed to do so benefited from the healthy growth of demand for their exports resulting from rapid growth of their trading partners. By 2000 and even 2010, most analysts regarded the increasing integration of the international economy to have been so successful that world trade liberalization was expected to continue indefinitely. There remained, and there remains, much to do. But instead of working to improve the functioning of the international economy, all that abruptly changed with the election of Donald Trump. He immediately reversed the direction of American trade policy. Among the first things he did when he assumed office in January 2017, as you know, was to withdraw the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been agreed to by 12 nations and whose formation had been led by the U.S. The other 11 signatories, as you know, proceeded without the U.S. in forming the CPTPP, for which, and the United Kingdom, of course, has recently agreed to join that. President Trump, however, removed the U.S. from that and increased American protectionism in many ways. He invoked the national security exception in the WTO to impose high tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, initially including, believe it or not, both Canada and Mexico as two security threats. He insisted on negotiating the American Free Trade Agreement with South Korea, as you know, as well as with NAFTA. He did more, including refusing to take measures that would enable WTO's dispute settlement mechanism to continue to operate, and starting a trade war with China, which Fred Berkson already spoke about. In addition to those measures, he of course abandoned the leadership role the U.S. had played in the WTO and the trading system, and he abandoned multilateralism as a way to deal with trade issues. When President Biden was elected, many observers, including me, expected that he would rapidly reverse many of the Trump protectionist measures. To the great disappointment of many, and again including me, he not only did not do so, but have further increased the U.S. departure from its earlier practices and principles. He retained the Trump tariffs that had been imposed with the trade war with China, and he introduced a number of measures that strengthened American protectionism, including Buy American provisions and the adoption most recently of an industrial policy identifying individual industries for support. During the Trump years, most trade professionals urged trade officials to use the WTO to address the issues they perceived with China, thinking and believing, and I don't think so correctly, that that would be a more satisfactory way to address these issues. The Trump administration failed to do so, and the Biden administration so far has been acting bilaterally on tariffs with China and bypassing the WTO in that and more, although not noticeably more and perhaps sometimes even less than had happened earlier. President Biden has also announced industrial policies of a sort that the United States had opposed for years. By the end of the last century, the evidence convinced almost all experts that industrial policy had rarely been successful. Indeed, industrial policies in most cases had consisted more of propping up the losers than in supporting the winners. Most advanced countries had abandoned attempting to predict winners and focused on research and development, upgrading the education and training of the labor force, and provision of quality infrastructure. In the CHIPS bill in the United States, however, large subsidies and tax breaks for companies investing in semiconductor fabs in the U.S. were authorized, provisions and requirements for electric vehicle and battery manufacturer were set, and much more. The Secretary of Commerce and the United States Trade Representative both stated that these were only the beginning and that they hoped to provide similar incentives for other industries. The pandemic, of course, hit the world early in 2020, and shortage of medical supplies led to protectionist pressures in many countries, although it was quickly recognized that it would be far better for the world to maintain open trade, and many of the restrictions were equally quickly removed. Even more important, when people had to stay home, demand patterns changed dramatically. Demand for restaurant and other services diminished a lot, but demand for goods, including items for home improvement, office furniture, and home renovation supplies, increased even more. The result was supply shortages, which in turn led politicians in additional countries to seek protectionist measures to attempt to safeguard their own country's supplies, although that proved once again not to be a very satisfactory solution. The increase, if misguided, protectionist pressures and actions in the U.S. have added to the political imperative to address the international trading system in other countries. The collapse of U.S. leadership in the international trading system has led many to question the future direction of globalization with respect to trade and also to capital flows and other linkages. Although the June ministerial meeting of the WTO led to more consensus than had been anticipated, and indeed even some cooperation between China and the United States, as Fred mentioned, few concrete measures have yet resulted, and many observers have opined that we are at the start of a new era of increasing protectionism. If that is true, we will certainly result in a much more stagnant global economy than has been experienced since the Second World War. However, many of the objections to the CHIPS bill are regarded by experts as infeasible. The idea that the U.S. could become self-sufficient in the manufacture of machinery to make semiconductors and, in addition, produce all the chips itself does not seem attainable, and it is anticipated the production of chips in the U.S. will cost 40 to 50% more than those produced by foreign competitors. There are even questions as to whether the U.S. can overcome the 2-year deficit it now confronts in innovation to the next generation. If chip producers raise prices enough to compensate for their costs, American-based firms will be confronted with higher costs for semiconductors than their competitors based in other countries. If, on the other hand, subsidies are increased enough so that American producers sell their output at world prices, the drain on the already overstretched budget will be huge. One can only hope that the politicians in the United States and those urging these policies will recognize that this has been a mistake and will back off quickly. And the best possible outcome for the U.S., Korea, and the rest of the world would be for the egregious policies embodied in the CHIPS Act and the Biden administration's belief in industrial policies of picking winners be reversed. The sooner that happens, the better. And if that happens, attention can then turn immediately to restoring the multilateral World Trading Organization approach to trade policy and further liberalization of the international economy. The dispute settlement mechanism could be restored, and with it, legitimate grievances about Chinese policies that are thought to be inconsistent with the WTO could be addressed there, and the Chinese could bring their complaints about the system to the same place. All trading nations in the world as a whole would benefit from that result. If they can use their influence on the U.S. both individually and jointly, show the damage these policies would have, it can certainly speed up the time when recognition of the folly of the CHIPS Act and of American focus on bilateralism occurs and speed up its change. There's much the U.S. could do, strengthening research and development, enhancing the quality and availability of needed skills, and more, that would be more likely to improve the U.S. competitive position in those and other industries and enable the restoration and enhancement of functioning of the system. Until that day comes, however, countries that are prospectively harmed by the shift to more protectionist global atmospheres can do much to mitigate the damage. First and foremost will be to refrain from undertaking protectionist actions of their own to the maximum extent possible. As I said at the beginning, many of the benefits of maintaining an outer orientation accrue because the competition to which domestic firms are exposed, the knowledge transfers that result, and the variety of goods and services available. Countries can also strengthen their own capabilities with better training, research and development, removal of policies that make the economy more rigid, and more. Those actions will be beneficial for the home economy, regardless of whether the WTO's functioning can be regardless of whether the WTO's functioning can be restored very quickly or whether it's slower. A second set of measures can also help mitigate the damage. Already, there remain some ways in which countries in disagreement can use the WTO to help resolve a dispute. In addition, a number of countries have formed a multi-party interim appeal agreement, which is agreed among themselves, and last I looked, there were 27 members. In it, they have agreed that they will use the WTO procedures and rules among themselves to resolve any disputes between them. The U.S. has not joined, but many issues with other large trading partners can be addressed, and it is being used. It would be possible, of course, to go further and form a multi-party trade agreement mirroring the WTO agreement without the U.S. To date, however, most countries have continued to honor their WTO commitments to their trading partners, and there's been no such move, and I think it would be very difficult. The final policy choice would, of course, be to abandon WTO principles and adopt domestic protectionist measures. There are obviously and predictably producers of import competing goods in each country who will advocate that position, and they're going to advocate it regardless of what really is the truth because of their own self-interest as they perceive it in the short run. Such a choice will be the worst solution, although the political pressures are understandable. A major reason for not doing so is that once protection is accorded, it is very difficult to remove, and when the WTO is restored, or when an improved successor organization is formed, countries that have adopted protectionist measures will have even more difficulty in removing them. Another important consideration is that there will be many other countries adversely affected by the paralysis of the WTO, and there will be many opportunities for trade among them. Most of all, however, it is in the interest of a country with a large share of GDP in traded goods to reserve its trading stance. Korea is correctly recognized as a major trading nation, and one that has supported the international system. Using its leverage to maintain and restore the system will surely, at a minimum, prevent the protectionist measures in its trading partners, and especially the U.S., with which it has a trade agreement, from getting worse. And when the day comes that the global system is again progressing, Korea's role and influence will be all the greater for having stayed the course. The international economy has experienced simultaneous major shocks. The pandemic, then the recovery from the pandemic, and the war between Russia and Ukraine, and all that not that long after the worldwide global recession. What is remarkable to date is how well the global economy has withstood these difficulties. In the long run, the benefit of closer integration will again lead to pressures for liberalization of the system. Those nations that do the least damage to their economies during the current phase will surely come out ahead when the costs of the current mistakes are clearly evident. I'm confident that IGE will contribute greatly in the coming years to understanding and improving the trading environment in the world, and much more. Mid-sized trading nations have an important role to play, and Korea will surely be a leader among them, and I have no doubt that IGE will do more than its share of the heavy lifting in getting back to the trading world we all want. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.